Hello and welcome to The Bottom Line. I'm Armaan.
I'm Julian.
And I'm Vyom.
Over the course of the coming episodes, we will be discussing global issues and current events from the perspectives of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
In this first episode, we will be discussing poverty, inequality, and universal internet empowerment around the world and in Hong Kong.
Today's episode is a little special because we have some guest speakers who will be sharing what they learned after speaking to the first person in Asia to have ever received a double bilateral hand transplant.
So to start off, let's talk about what defines poverty. Absolute poverty and the poverty line.
So I think we all know what poverty means, but perhaps not the specifics. What's important about the poverty line is the disparity between the ones in poverty and the ones not. Put simply, poverty is defined by the Cambridge Dictionary as the condition of being extremely poor. Financially, an individual is said to be in absolute poverty if they earn under $1.90 in US currency per day, lacking the financial resources and stability to ensure a minimum standard quality of life. In comparison, the average monthly income of a Hong Konger is nearly $2,600 a month, or $87 a day.
According to the most recent estimates by the World Bank, in 2015, 10% of the world's population lived below the poverty line. That's 734 million people. Compared to nearly 36% or 1.9 billion people in 1990, the world has made significant progress in the last 2 years, but much more remains to be done. Let's talk about relative poverty. Meanwhile, relative or secondary poverty is when an individual earns just enough money to afford the necessities, receiving 50% less than the average household income. This means that many are forced to employ coping mechanisms to deal with their financial burdens and enjoy a lower quality of life than others in the region.
Recently, the COVID-19 impact or the novel coronavirus has had a huge impact on global poverty rates. The global poverty rate has increased in 2020 for the first time in years, from 8.2 to 8.6%. This might not seem like a lot, but the poverty rate in 2020 should have dropped to 7.8%. The ILO says that in India alone, more than 400 million people risk sliding into poverty because they are forced to rely on informal work. Informal work is work which is not regulated by the government and is not taxed, which can put people at risk both physically and mentally. According to the United Nations Development Programme, developed countries have 55 hospital beds, more than 30 doctors, and 81 nurses for every 10,000 people. However, for the same number of people in a less developed country, there are only 7 beds, 2.5 doctors, and 6 nurses. Even basics that you may take for granted, such as soap and clean water, are luxuries for many. Lockdowns have also made the digital divide more apparent. Billions of people don't have reliable broadband internet connections, which limits their ability to work, contribute to the economy, continue their education, or socialize with their loved ones.
This can lead on to unemployment, which has hit the world very hard, including Hong Kong. Hong Kong has registered the biggest unemployment rate in 15 years due to COVID-19, which is probably one of the biggest problems the world's faced for a long time, at 6.2%. These statistics could be detrimental to people who already are not secure in terms of monetary gain and could increase the amount of poverty in the world and in Hong Kong due to the lack of employment, meaning lack of money. This links to businesses shutting down. We can link this again to COVID-19. Due to COVID-19, businesses that depend on customers to survive have been shut down because of the lack of customers during this trying time. An article from CNBC by Anjali Sundaram shows data from the business tracking website Yelp and shows that over 150,000 businesses have closed due to the effects of COVID-19.
COVID-19 has also had a huge impact on people's ability to pay rent. This has caused the number of forced evictions globally to rise. The UN has warned of an impending tsunami of evictions, and the UN's experts have called on governments around the world to respect housing rights and to halt all evictions until the pandemic ends. A UN special reporter on the right to housing has commented on this. saying that the right to housing is central to any response in the pandemic, and losing your home could be equivalent to losing your life. Even though some governments have put in place temporary bans on forced evictions, many people continue to lose their homes. More than 11,000 people were thrown out by their landlords in Brazil and Kenya, and more are at risk of eviction. Forced relocation is also a threat in less developed countries like Haiti and increasing in many others. And Rajagopal emphasized that the danger is global. Governments must not allow people to become homeless during this pandemic because they can lose their job and will be unable to pay their rent or mortgage. A moratorium is also essential on clearing encampments or tent cities of homeless people. During a pandemic, when people are asked to stay at home to protect themselves and others, forced evictions are even more odious and may constitute grave violations of humanitarian law. When people are deprived of shelter, they become more vulnerable to COVID 19, heightening the risk of widespread contagion. Something else that people are unable to pay are their bills. According to an MNP Consumer Debt Index report, it found that 30% of British Columbia residents now say that they're unable to pay their bills and debt repayment obligations each month, representing an 8-point jump since the last report in June. Those who have lost employment or wages are struggling with financial uncertainty. To make matters worse, many aren't sure whether their job will be around after the pandemic. Just over 44% said that they're less than 200 Canadian dollars away from being insolvent by the end of the month, and almost half of British Columbia residents surveyed said they're worried that either themselves or someone in their household could lose their job, while 45% said they're worried about their debt level. One of the most devastating impacts of this pandemic is the reversal of the progress in healthcare and education that we as a species has made. New UNDP estimates for global human development, as a combined measure of the world's education, health, and living standards, is on course to decline this year, for the first time since the concept was developed in 1990. This decline is expected across the majority of countries, both rich and poor, in every region of the world. Global per capita income is also expected to fall 4%. The World Bank has warned that the virus could push between 40 and 60 million people into extreme poverty this year, with sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia being the hardest hit regions.
The International Labour Organization, or the ILO, estimates that half of working people could lose their jobs within the next few months, and that the virus could cost the global economy over $10 trillion US. Now, the World Food Programme says that 265 million people will face crisis levels of hunger unless direct action is taken. In developing countries, especially those in crisis, will suffer the most, along with the already vulnerable all over the world. Those that rely on the informal economy, women, those living with disabilities, refugees, and the displaced, as well as those that suffer from stigma. With schools closed, UNDP estimates that effective out-of-school rates could regress to levels not seen since the 1980s, the largest reversal ever, taking us back to a time even before the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, or even the Millennium Development Goals were established, threatening the hard work and progress of the past 30 years. Now, going into the SDGs, these are a list of Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations, and I'll introduce them to you. Number 1, no poverty. 2, zero hunger. Good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, protection for life below water and life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and number 17, partnership for all the goals.
The COVID-19 pandemic has especially affected migrant workers, especially those in less economically developed countries, such as India. There are an estimated 139 million migrants in India, according to the World Economic Forum. Most migrants in the country originate from within India's borders, in states such as Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, followed by Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. The cities of Mumbai and Delhi attract the highest number of migrants. Migrant workers mostly comprise of daily wage laborers working in the manufacturing and construction industries. They are often denied adequate healthcare, nutrition, housing, and sanitation, since many of them work in the informal sector. They are mostly from rural areas, but live in cities for work for most of the year. Many have no savings and live in factory dormitories, which were shut down due to the lockdown. In India, due to this, many migrant workers have been unable to get to their homes due to a shutdown of vital transportation infrastructure and transport links. Indian migrant workers during the COVID 19 pandemic have faced multiple hardships, with their factories and workplaces shut down due to the lockdown imposed on the country. Millions of migrant workers had to deal with the loss of income, food shortages, and uncertainty about the future. While the government has tried to resolve this with various solutions such as rationing cards, many migrant workers are unaware of the government's strategies and thus cannot reap the benefits. Following this, many of them and their families went hungry. Thousands of them began walking back home to their indigenous villages with no means of transport due to the lockdown. In response, the central and state governments took various measures to help them and later arranged transport for them. However, unfortunately, more than 300 migrant workers have died due to the lockdown, with reasons ranging from starvation, suicides, exhaustion, road and rail accidents, police brutality, and denial of timely medical care.
Now, we've introduced to you what poverty looks like. Let's delve deeper into inequality. A major aspect of inequality is prejudice and discrimination. Well, prejudice and discrimination are closely linked, but they are not the same. Prejudice is when a person has a biased attitude towards a particular group on the basis of their preconceived notions, while discrimination is when this prejudice is acted upon. People may have prejudiced beliefs or act in a prejudiced way because they are conforming to what is called the social norm, or a set of accepted behaviors of a social group. The next type of prejudice is gender inequality. Now, let's look at gender inequality, which is brought about by gender discrimination. One of the most widely used metrics to measure the extent of gender inequality in a country is the Global Gender Gap Index, which measures the relative differences between men and women in health, education, economy, and political participation. Now, let's look at a country that ranks quite highly in the gender equality space. Iceland ranks first for gender equality. The reasons for this are that culturally there exists a notion of strong women, especially in terms of religion. Feminism became a mass movement in the 1960s and 70s. Later on, 90% of working women went on strike and established the Women's Alliance in 1982, leading to a jump in women's participation in politics. Now let's look at Yemen, which ranks lowest in gender equality. The reason for this is that women are systematically denied access to jobs and underrepresented in public office. They bear disproportionate responsibility for unpaid caregiving and domestic work, and 35% of women have said that they have experienced physical and/or sexual violence.
That's terrible, and relates to another very important type of inequality, that is racial inequality. An example of this is starting in May 2020, in when pent-up anger about racism in America was finally let loose after George Floyd was killed by a police officer in the same month. These protests have become quite violent over time, emphasizing the anger that has been created because of inequality and race in what is supposed to be an incredibly liberal and accepting society, hence united in the United States of America. These protests are a strong example of what it feels to be within a minority and understand the inequality you face for something that is out of your control, such as your skin color. And leading on from the subject of inequality, we have a special segment for our first episode. We've teamed up with a group called Life Beyond Me, and they'll be displaying a segment about the first person in Hong Kong to have had a double bilateral hand transplant and her difficulties about that procedure.
Today we'll be interviewing Shreya, and she will be telling us more about a transplant which she underwent, and this is for our nonprofit organization, Life Beyond Me. Shreya, could you introduce yourself? How old are you, and which surgery did you experience?
Hi everyone, my name is Shreya Siddhan Gaudar. I am 22 years old. Currently, I'm pursuing my bachelor's in economics and I live in Pune, which is situated in India.
Which surgery did you undergo, and what was the nature of it? So, what caused you to take this surgery?
I used to be an engineering student at that time. I was 18 years old and I was pursuing it from from Manipal Institute of Technology, and the college is situated in Karnataka. We had 1 week break in our college, so I had come home. The driver dozed off. That led to the bus getting overturned completely, and it was dragged for about 100 meters or so. So both my forearms were completely crushed. I was rushed to the hospital from there, but unfortunately, doctors couldn't do anything to reimplant those forearms. I went from being this independent teenager who was doing her engineering to a dependent girl. I needed my mom for every little thing. It could be as simple as scratching my nose, that I needed her for that as well. So that was how dependent I was. About the surgery, I have had a bilateral hand transplant, which we'll be talking about more in detail. No transplant is easy. Of course, it was a rocky road. So, like I mentioned, I was dependent on my mom for every little thing. Before the accident itself, I was aware that can have kidney transplant or liver or heart transplant. I had no idea that we could have a hand transplant as well. We were exploring options, okay, after the amputation. So when we were exploring the options, of course, we everyone knows you can have artificial limbs or prosthesis, as they are known as. So that was known, but then we got to know that the bilateral upper limb amputees can have a hand transplant as well. Luckily enough, when we googled hand transplant in India, we got to know that there had been three successful hand transplant surgeries that had been performed by then, and they were actually independent at that time. I mean, I cannot describe the feeling when I came to know about it. I was so glad that medical science had advanced so much.
Of course, some countries have an opt-out system, some countries have an opt-in system. For those who have opt-in systems and families who are a bit reluctant to consider organ donation, what is something that you would like to let them know about the recipients of organ donation, the process, or anything in general?
About the opt-in and opt-out system, well, in India, we have quite a few hurdles. We have to create more and more awareness. It has to reach the rural areas in India, the message of organ donation, because I guess about 60 or 65% of the Indian population resides in rural areas. We have to educate them as well. There have to be some reformations in our healthcare system. We have to target all the government hospitals, or even the smaller hospitals, which of course they may not be transplant centers, but
They may
we
not
have
be
to
equipped
train
with
them
the.
and make them organ retrieval centers. Because brain death can happen in these hospitals as well. But if you're not retrieving, if the doctors are not trained enough, then well, that person, as it is after brain death, he's not coming back again. But the people who are suffering from organ failure, they are going to lose their lives as well. So we don't want that to happen. So we need more training for the healthcare professionals. And I guess it's about the organ donation rate in India is about zero point 0.8, I suppose. We if we do all of these things, hopefully in another 10 years, if it reaches about 5 or 6 people per million population, then we can definitely get an opt out system in India. In fact, recently, because of all the advocacy, that because I wanted to start advocating hand transplant, because I've met quite a lot of amputees, and trust me, I've met all kinds. It can be a unilateral, bilateral. I've met people who have lost all 4 limbs as well, and they probably need it more than even I do.
Were you in a situation where you weren't able to properly fund your transplant, or was there some sort of prejudice that you had to like overcome to be ordered to have your transplant, or anything similar to that?
Thankfully, my parents could afford the transplant, so that was not an issue. But I guess this poverty is an issue for many other people, because not everyone comes from a privileged background, so money is quite an issue when it comes to going for any kind of transplant, I'd say. If you're not well off, and it's quite expensive. But I did not have that problem, so I'm not the right person to talk about that part. But yeah, I can definitely talk about inequality, the prejudices that I faced. I did not mention that in the interview. See, the thing is, of course, right after the amputation, when I was still in the ICU, people had already started, passing comments
Oh,
about me. And yeah, it happens more in our country, I feel, because you have this itch to comment on other people's lives. Uh, uh, and I don't know, I guess we Indians just love to poke our nose in other people's businesses. So that started happening even when I was still in the ICU. What, it was just 3 days after the accident.
oh my God.
I mean, I was dealing with my own emotions, right? And
Yeah.
my parents had to take care of me as well. But they have been extremely supportive and brave enough to shield me from all the negativity that people were projecting on us. One of the major comments that I got was like, someone told my mom that I get scared when I look at Shreya or people like her. So they had already put me in a category. That was a bit harsh.
Mm-hmm.
But and uh, well, it felt terrible at that time, but and right now I'm over that fact.
Oh,
And
yeah.
one of the other bad things was I'm an only child, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
so my parents have only me. So in India, it's like, okay, so so you have only one child and she's a daughter and now she's lost both her hands. So like, there's no one else to support my parents when they get old, since I am already going to be dependent on them. So some people went to the extent that they suggested my parents to go for another child.
Oh my God.
At that age, I mean, come on, I was already 18 and my parents were in their they were in their mid 40s and nearing 50 or so. So it was their decision to have only one child. I feel no one else has the right to question that aspect.
Yeah.
Uh, if someone wants to have one child or two child, it's completely up to them.
Mm-hmm.
That was a terrible thing that people could have said to them. I don't understand the mentality in the sense that even if my parents would have had another child, me losing hands wouldn't have made them any less uh, sad about it. They would have been just as much upset about the fact that I have lost my hand. I mean, come on,
Yeah.
even if you have 10 children and one of your kids loses hands, you wouldn't be happy about it, right? So I guess
Yeah.
people need to think before they speak anything. Because if they would have been in a similar situation like us, they wouldn't have
Mm-hmm.
liked these comments either.
Yeah.
So, well, I guess we just have to be a little more kind. I mean, we have to be
Mm-hmm.
kinder. Uh, Hopefully, we get there.
So now let's look at modern approaches to resolving inequality. Let's look at universal internet empowerment. But before we do that, let's contextualize how the internet works and how it's accessed. The internet is a decentralized system of interconnected servers and clients that can send and receive data over a network. It allows people to share information with one another without actually having to physically meet the recipient. Now, that sounds great, but over 4 billion people worldwide have no access to the internet. That's close to 50%. So why is the internet inaccessible to so many people? Well, according to a recent study by Facebook, there are 4 main reasons for why this is. Number 1, availability. Availability of the internet through wired, wireless, or satellite connections remains limited for many. Oftentimes, the necessary technological infrastructure, for example satellite and microwave backhaul links, is simply not available. In some places, a UPS, or uninterrupted power supply, at an Internet Service Provider Domain Name System, or IPS DNS, is also missing, requiring repeater sites for backhaul and diesel generators where grid power is absent. Recently, mobile network connections have, quote, aided in closing the availability gap, according to the World Economic Forum. As much as 96% of the world's population does, in theory, have some access to a 2G network, but this technology will only cover basic data connectivity. At least 1.6 billion people have no access to 3G or 4G at all, they say. The second factor is affordability. One key barrier to access is income and the cost of owning an internet device. But this is reducing every year as smartphones have become cheaper and SIM cards have become more inexpensive.
The third reason is relevance. Many in developing countries find accessing the internet unhelpful for their day-to-day activities. They may also not be catered to sufficiently in terms of language. Only 10 languages make up 89% of the internet, with 56% of it in English. With over 7,000 languages spoken worldwide, the internet would need to accommodate 800 languages in order to reach 98% of the world's population. Finally, internet readiness is also an important reason. In many countries, the literacy rate is still low, with people being digitally illiterate and unfamiliar with modern technology. We've provided a lot of examples about inequalities, such as the disparity between the average wage and the poverty line, inequality in gender and race, and links to COVID-19, which is far too large of a situation to not talk about. These examples show the unfairness of the world today, and if you've been listening to this video essay today, our main takeaway is to acknowledge the immorality of our culture that has led to such disparity between each other as human beings.
Now, before we wrap things up, we'd like to share with you some local volunteering opportunities here in Hong Kong offering vital assistance to those in need.
There's a great many opportunities for service engagement. The bigger organizations like Crossroads are always a safe bet if you're wanting to help out around Hong Kong. But some other things you could consider is the non-profit organization Food Angel by the Bow Charity Foundation, which are helping to redistribute food that would become waste to those that are underprivileged in Hong Kong, which I'm sure is more important than ever under the coronavirus climate. Another option could be found on socialkorea.org, which is in partnership with Peer-to-Peer, which is a student-led social enterprise hoping to help underprivileged Hong Kong students gain extra help by pairing these students with other fellow students so that they can work together. The organization is hoping to help fulfill 3 sustainable development goals set by the UN, that being the first, no poverty, the 4th, quality education, and the 10th, reduced inequalities.
Hands on Hong Kong describes on their website how, quote, even before the COVID crisis, 1 in 3 Hong Kong youths reported feeling anxious or depressed. This has only been exacerbated by the fear of the pandemic, the change in daily routine, and the lack of social interaction this year. The Youth Empowered team has partnered with Save the Children to address this and empower other youths to stay active and positive through co-creating a mental wellness journal. Starting Sunday, the 31st of January 2021, volunteers will be able to, quote, work on a bilingual digital journal with a focus on mental wellness filled with useful resources such as mood trackers, gratitude pages, and uplifting words of student-powered advice. Volunteers will be divided into 4 groups and responsible for different tasks, including layout design, graphic creation, mental wellness content, and creation of digital support. Sign up now on handsonhongkong.com. Additionally, Sunshine Action has also organized a hot meal distribution to the homeless and street sleepers on the 23rd of January 2020, from 6:20 p.m. to 8:20 p.m. Join the team at the Fu Chung Mall Future Business Field in front of the Nam Tsing MTR Station Exit A to help out and make a difference.
Links to all these organizations will be in the description below. And thank you everyone so much for listening to our first episode. See you around.